Hello, my name is Rebecca Ebel. I'm the owner of Contemporary Art Matters. On the occasion of our current exhibition, City of Incurable Women, photographs by Laura Larson, I'm privileged to present a conversation with the artist and Jennifer Lange, curator of film video studio program at the Wexner Center for the Arts. This talk was originally scheduled to take place in the gallery. However, in this time of social distancing, we have gathered here virtually. I was first introduced to Laura through her New York gallery owner, Jill Weinberg of Linen Weinberg, where she's been exhibiting since the 1990s. Laura is originally from Pittsburgh. She studied English at Oberlin College and received her BA here in Ohio. She did the independent study program at the Whitney Museum of American Art before going to Rutgers for her MFA in visual art. Her photographs have been widely exhibited, reproduced in numerous publications, and are in public and private collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Laura is currently a professor of photography and integrated media studies at Ohio University. Jennifer Lange received her BA from Connecticut College in New London and an MA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She joined the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2001, and with the residency program has worked with hundreds of artists, including Phil Collins and Josiah McElhaney. She curated the exhibitions Cruzamentos, Contemporary Art in Brazil, and Sadie Benning, Suspended Animation. She also curates monthly screening programs in the Box, the Wexner's dedicated video exhibition space, for which she's organized monthly programs with numerous artists, including Joe Sola, Anna Gaskill, and many, many others. So it's my pleasure to hand the mic over to Jennifer and let you lead the conversation with Laura.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be doing this conversation with you, Laura. It's we have to admit these were kind of strange circumstances. I'd much rather be in the space with you and especially your work, which I feel like offers so much more with physical bodies in the space, I mean, especially given the subject of the work. So the exhibition is made up of selections from two series, The City of Incurable Women and All the Women I Know. And Laura, both of these series continue your interest in the history of photography itself and in exploring that slippery space between documentary and fiction. But maybe let's start with The City of Incurable Women. The works on view in the exhibition are large-scale color photographs, and they're part of an ongoing project that has a book component and eventually a film. While the stories of the hospital and the doctors and the individual patients is really fascinating and probably warrants a whole separate conversation, maybe we could focus on the history of the photographic practice at the hospital. The hospital called Salpêtrière in Paris was one of the first to have a photography studio, right?
That's correct. It was Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot who was the physician who treated hysteric patients at Salpêtrière. He pioneered the use of photography as a diagnostic tool. So they had a studio in the hospital. His students, his support staff became trained in making what sort of looks to contemporary eyes like a portrait studio. And they photographed the patients, who were largely women, in this studio. And it was a way to document the different stages of a hysterical episode.
So the subject of hysteria actually kind of feels like a natural subject for you to explore, given some of your previous explorations of kind of lesser known female histories. I mean, there's the Your Hidden Mother project, but also your interest in seances. Can you talk a little bit about the interest in hysteria and sort of the We'll get to this in a moment, I guess, the sort of the contemporary relevance of it.
It's a great question, and one that I could probably talk for weeks about this. In many ways, I'd say all of my work comes back to questions about what photography is, and it's historically it's a very new medium, and sort of I think this is part of why I continually land in 19th century subjects, because not only was this the birth of the medium, this is the birth of our nation, of the world as industrial capitalist world, and I also I return to stories that are about female experience. So, and part of, the generative question for me is thinking about those early forms, those histories, and rather than thinking about a kind of model of photography is that we've progressed technologically over the last 150 or so years, but really thinking about the sort of the kernel of what photography is and how it was seeded in the 19th century, and the ways in which that is still very much true. Like, even though the materials and the technologies have changed really radically. So this is, again, just like a time period I continually come back to as with a great deal of fascination. I can share an anecdote, which is in some ways I've long known about this sort of subject matter and these photographs and these histories, but I had the sort of serendipity of being contacted by my now collaborator, novelist Mon Casey, who was introduced to my work, and really like in a kind of blind call asked me if I wanted to collaborate. And that she was interested in these photographs, and at this time in my life, I was a new mother, and I was in a somewhat very isolated situation, and it felt a little bit like a lifeline that was thrown to me in terms of, here was somebody who wanted to partner with me and do research and produce something collaboratively. So there's that, which is the personal anecdote. But in terms of the sort of larger, my interest in the material and the histories is in thinking about ways in which female experience, and in particular social experience, has been pathologized or was pathologized in the sort of diagnosis and treatment of hysteria. And for me, even though hysteria is considered a kind of historical relic in some ways, notions of women being out of control or ruled by their emotions when in fact our sort of social experiences are deeply traumatizing and manifest themselves in sort of physiological and emotional ways. This seems to me to be very much still a topic of relevance, and in particular, and this is definitely a sort of leading interest of mine, is thinking about it within our kind of contemporary political situation. And so, yes, this was how I got. These were the serendipities and the how I got to the material, and then the ways in which its relevance was, deeply personal and sort of political for me.
Right. And while the inspiration or the initial influence, is this historical story, the images on view and the images that you're making are very contemporary, very much of this moment. Part of it is due, I think, to the settings that they're in. Could you talk a little bit about the settings are kind of a combination of institutional spaces like gymnasiums, but also spare domestic interior spaces. Can you talk about the settings for some of these photographs?
The direct link in terms of the research that preceded making these photographs was that the hospital, Pitié-Salpêtrière, was also a teaching hospital. And I was interested in making this connection between, the sort of study and treatment of illness, but also the ways in which there is an element by which these women, contemporary women, are sort of we live, just the fact of being in culture is like being in a learning environment. So I very much selected the sites with this in mind. There's a classroom with a blackboard behind. There's a drawing studio. I photographed in a high school gym, and there's a whole other chapter of the work which is in landscapes and sort of natural environments. So that's sort of another, in some ways I feel like that chapter the dialogue between sort of social environments and learning environments is not sketched out in the exhibition, but I'm really trying to think about ways in which a reference to our cultural experiences can be kind of brought into it. You want to cue me up again?
Yeah, totally. Well, maybe going back to the history of photography and the history specifically of this hospital that was, they were staging these, and I'm going to link to essentially what you were doing is sort of staging these moments of hysteria, or these hysterical episodes in the hospital in the 19th century. It's highly problematic medically, ethically, scientifically there's the artifice is so clear, even though what they were doing was documentary, in nature, I guess. And so I'm interested in how that influenced the way you set up these photographs, and maybe we'll get into collaboration that will bridge to collaboration, but really this idea of documentary and artifice coming to the fore in the images that you're creating.
I think I'm always really looking to kind of go right into that gray area, and I'm not terribly interested in like high sort of theatricality. I if anything, I feel like my gravitational pull is towards something that's naturalistic, something that kind of allows chance, serendipity to come into the work in some ways. And especially when I'm working with performers, to sort of to sort of have their sensibilities emerge in some ways. And this is really true in my work, since there's so much performance involved. So I would definitely say I'm right in the middle there in terms of how I'm making them. There's direction, but there's a great deal of improvisation going on. And I guess this is, again, like the best way I can put it is like this gray area is my North Star, which I know sounds like a very contradictory thing to say, but I think it's where there's a kind of vitality in the work for me. And it's also a way that not only am I connecting with these histories, which are fascinating to me, but it's a way in which I'm kind of connecting with my subjects too.
Right, and it provides, I think, another connection between past and present. It brings those histories into a contemporary context, I think, in an interesting way.
Again, like the thing that was really fascinating to me about the history is there were these public teaching lectures that women, essentially performed for an audience of people who came to sort of study with Charcot. And, so there was that element of performance. There was the element of removing these women from treatment and sort of taking them into a studio, and they would be sort of prompted, that's the best word I can use, to sort of become, sort of exhibit their symptoms, right? And again, the sort of background for me is it's not that I would ever question that these women were ill, they were suffering. And this, in many ways, my point of contact with it was to honor this suffering, but to sort of frame it in a way that these are images that are constructed, that are very much based in real experience, and at the same time there are these different pressures through which the images came to be. And and again, like it's right in this gray area, rather than like these are fakes, they were only doing it so they could get like a nice bed in a room by themselves, right? Like there were perks to performing well in the hospital. It didn't mean that this was a kind of highly contrived, not only a highly contrived situation, but one in which there was a great deal of suffering, and just like a kind of a way of thinking about the experiences of these women and my subjects as well, just again to ground it in the present in my photographs, but just a number of different pressures that are part of how they came into being.
Laura, you and I talked a little bit yesterday about in this contemporary body of work, the women in these photographs are, rather than inciting them, maybe we'll talk about this gray area, I guess, rather than inciting them, to hysteric episodes, it's asking them in a way to, the gestures and movements that you're capturing are sort of performed resistance. Specifically, had me thinking of this film that I saw a few years ago, In the Intense Now, and it's made up of archival footage. But the most amazing part of this film is this moment when the filmmaker focuses in on a body in the street in Paris, 1968. So this is during these, massive protests. And it's a body a male body that he's focusing on, which is winding up to throw a rock at the police. And he rewinds it and slows it down and loops it over and over again. And it really focuses on this, what becomes this gesture of resistance. And in that moment, really the poetics of resistance that's what we're focusing on, really, or that's what's emerging. And I see that completely in the City of Incurable Women. In works like Huddle and Mass Hysteria, you're likewise really focusing on not only the poetics of resistance, but also the potential. There's like this, in freezing this moment, there's this potential of energy. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that, the idea of gestures of resistance and capturing this pent-up energy that the women that you're working with are, you're asking them to tap into.
I think when we talk about sort of images of resistance, we sort of begin to imagine, the protester of '68 throwing a rock, or one of my favorite photographs of one of my favorite photographers, Susan Mayzalis, of the Molotov cocktail man, like these ideas of uprising and a kind of sense of solidarity or focus. And in terms of staging the photographs, I really would sort of zero in on a gesture, or the posture of a body. Oftentimes I was really looking for ways, the photographs are not, as we discussed, they're not naturalistic at all, right? It's like there's not even a sense of like these bodies, I think about like sports photography or something, and where like, it's like the shot where like the body is super graceful in the middle of like some like consummate physical act. But there's a sense that they're being pulled in a lot of different directions at the same time. There's this sense of strangeness to the postures of the body. And I guess I was really, again, like what I was trying to experiment with, or what I was experimenting with, was trying to telegraph that sense of complexity or conflict in the body.
I was as we were talking about resistance, I was thinking about another word that maybe better captures. There's a fine line between resistance maybe and resilience. I hear those two words often talked about together, and maybe resilience is the more, in terms of these images, is the more appropriate word, because it for me, when I think about that word, it takes into account the pressures and oppression that are being imposed on individuals and on the body, but it also there's something generative and an energy that almost feeds off of that oppression. Like the resilience is growth in spite of the oppression. So maybe that's kind of a more, just as I'm sitting here thinking about it, a more interesting way to think about those images. Because there's also as you pointed out, in mind muscle, it's that's exhaustion, really, right? It's pressure being imposed, and but also a kind of it's almost, you can feel the weight of the world on this body.
I think that's a perfect way of thinking about it, because in some ways, and maybe this was sort of at the heart of what I was talking about before, but resilience is what happens every day, right? Resilience is how we survive. Resilience is how we prioritize, how we metabolize our experiences, or in the case of the kind of background of this work, trauma. Resistance is, I mean, in some ways, resistance is the theatrical, right? It's about like a kind of a theatrical gesture, and and of course they're deeply linked, right? And there's definitely, the gestures of resistance are all over the work, right? There's the hands up, don't shoot, in Ecstasy, which is, again, that is a quotation of a gesture that occurs over and over in Charcot's photographs. There's the gestures in Mass Hysteria of the sort of the fists and like the kind of like the pounding and that sort of thing. But then, yeah, the exhaustion as a kind of script for movement was huge for all of the work, and kind of, again, like almost working with the performers to think about the body inhabiting both of those places or multiple places at the same time.
Bringing it back to resilience, actually, I mean, part I think of what I feel in these photographs is that, and this, maybe we can start now talking about collaboration, because it seems so important actually to both the series on view, but the collaboration, the collaborative process of making City of Incurable Women. I mean, that also is a form of resilience and survival, in survival by building community.
Absolutely. And again, I've been working on this project. As you noted before, there's a book, and I've been working on the book for a while, but the bulk of the photographic work has been produced after the 2016 presidential election. So in many ways, there are deep ties to the ways in which, I've, looked to my community for solace, looked to my community to kind of build resistance, and like this project would not have been possible without the sort of deep support and collaboration of my friends and then people I've met along the way. So I've worked really closely with Lucille Toth, who is an assistant professor in the Department of French at OSU Zanesville. I think that's right. And she's I had the good fortune of meeting her, and with Sheila Restack and Carmen Winant, we curated a program of experimental lectures, and we reached out to her to do a lecture. And she's a trained dancer. Her scholarship sort of lies at the intersection between dance and the medical humanities and literature. And so in many ways, it was just meeting her was a kind of gift to, to me, because she's my friend now, but also to the project. And we've worked really closely together in directing the work. And she's the subject of the work too. She's in the group photographs Mass Hysteria and Huddle. She's in Arc de Cercle. You can't see her head in Arc de Cercle. And then the photograph Lucille T and Mathilde G, she's appears in that as well. So, having people in front of the camera, just the nature of the relationship with the performers, which was very open-ended, very collaborative. I very much welcomes their sort of input into this, and it's I couldn't have done it without them, right?
So moving then to the series All the Women I Know, which is very different. It feels related to City of Incurable Women, but it feels entirely different sort of stylistically and aesthetically. It's a series of black and white photographs at a totally different scale, much more, smaller, much more intimate black and white photographs. And there is a sense of resistance in those, resisting the gaze, resisting the expectations, the viewer's expectations of what traditional portrait photography is supposed to give you, and it is quite literally a collection of images of all the women you know, or it will be.
Well, that's the hope. Turns out, you know a lot of women, or I know a lot of women. So that project is definitely an overlapping one with the city. It really has kind of taken on its own life in the last year or so, and it originally, what the idea was, almost to create a kind of ghost archive of those Charcot photographs, but like having everyone turned away from the camera. And and I tried it with color and digital, and like it just wasn't quite working. They felt really, really inert to me. And at a certain point, I shot one, and actually the first one I shot is in the show, which is the one of Danny Restack. And all of a sudden, like something, and it was something about like shooting with my 35 millimeter camera. And, I've only ever owned one 35 millimeter camera. So it's like the first camera I ever bought, shooting with black and white film, which is really still truly remains like my first and abiding love. And somehow the dynamic of it just really changed for me. It became more intimate. The idea of place became a really important aspect of it. Again, like I kind of set up these obstructions where I was like, I'm only going to shoot half a roll of film. I'm going to do it somewhere close to where this person lives or works or has some meaning for them. I'm not going to overthink it. It became in some ways like a kind of, I always envy painters or people who have like a drawing practice, who can kind of have a sort of daily contact with their work. And it's very different for photographers and filmmakers, because there's so many, because it's so collaborative, and because there's sort of multiple steps to working with these materials and editing, etc. And so it really kind of became, in the in the timeline of making City of Incurable Women, which, you know, was always about like bringing people together and marshaling resources, like where I could do something on a really daily basis. And again, like this was really emerging, you know, at a time where I was thinking very much about like networks of women supporting one another, ways in which we can even imagine collectives of women, and, you know, at the same time be very aware of our differences and sort of think about, you know, think about those connections in ways that, again, here's that word, to honor difference, but to imagine collectivity.
Mm-hmm. As someone who has participated in the project, and my daughters have both participated in the project, it's and I know a lot of the participants in the project, it is interesting to recognize people, and also to imagine, even in the people who I know quite intimately, my own kids obviously, but friends, to sort of imagine, I don't know, imagine narratives, imagine things that that I just can't know. It gets to that gray area again. This, you know, representing a person is almost impossible in their totality, because we're such complex emotional and physical beings. So it's those images are really striking and moving to me in that way.
Well, I want to thank you, Laura, and thank you, Jennifer. I really enjoyed this conversation. This has been a really important exhibition for me, I think, personally, to have the opportunity to work with you, but to present work that I think is keenly valuable in today's cultural conversation. What we do in our work life is to push the world forward, and hopefully in 100 years there will be a whole new conversation around this, or hopefully it'll take a lot less time than that. But I'm very grateful to you to make this time. Thank you, Jennifer, for hosting such a fruitful conversation, and thanks to our Ralph Photo studio team for putting this all together.